I'm Emily Chang, and this is the best of Bloomberg Technology, where we bring you all our top interviews from this week in tech. Coming up, Amazon spurns New York, scrapping its plan to build a second headquarters in the city after a backlash from some residents and politicians. Plus, U.S. lawmakers blast T-Mobile's proposed $26.5 billion purchase of Sprint as leaders from both companies testify before the new Democratic-led House. And we take you behind the wheel of an electric car that is gaining attention out of Canada. But first, to our lead. A growing backlash has caused Amazon to back out of plans to build a campus in New York City. The deal had promised 40,000 jobs over the next 2 decades with an average salary of $150,000. One problem with the grand plan, local opposition was fervent from the beginning. Lawmakers resented being excluded from negotiations for the deal, while community groups feared rising rents in the neighborhood would push out longtime residents. For reaction, we spoke with New York City Council member Jimmy Van Bramer, who had opposed this deal from the start, and Bloomberg Tech senior executive editor Brad Stone.
No one's running a victory lap, but what I would say is this is a victory because we fought for our values. We challenged this deal from the beginning because Amazon has a track record of not treating its workers right and is being horribly anti-union. We exposed them during this process over the last few months, where they declared once and for all that they would fight any attempts of any employees of Amazon directly to organize. That's antithetical to my values as a progressive New York City Democrat. I think it's antithetical to most of us in New York City, and they refused to budge. At the end of the day, Amazon chose to leave. No one killed Amazon. Amazon walked off the field because they refused to change their ways, and they simply didn't want, I think, to risk having to allow their employees to organize, which is outrageous.
Now, Brad, Amazon has turned some of its supporters into enemies as well. This coming from Mayor Bill de Blasio, who said, "We gave Amazon the opportunity to be a good neighbor and do business in the greatest city in the world. Instead of working with the community, Amazon threw away that opportunity." If Amazon can't recognize what that's worth, its competitors will.
Well, I think Mayor de Blasio is doing some damage control here. He was a proponent of the deal that is now blown up in his face. But look, this is a catastrophic outcome of this year-and-a-half process for everyone involved. You know, Amazon was looking for a partner, which it felt that it didn't quite have anymore in Seattle. It conducted this very public search. It did make mistakes in New York City. I think it should have trotted out Jeff Bezos more publicly to support this deal. I think maybe putting him in a room with politicians and officials like the councilman might have helped. But I also think on the other side, and I would like to ask the councilman, you know, you're never going to change Amazon's stripes. It has historically been, you know, anti-union when it comes to its fulfillment centers. These are white-collar jobs in particular in Queens. It's going to sell, it has said, technology like facial recognition to the federal government and departments like ICE. So what is losing these 25,000 jobs? How does that help your constituents at all, many of whom supported the deal?
Well, look, I think it helps our city in the long run. It also helps the nation, quite frankly, because if we had not fought this fight in New York City, then we would have had other corporations also saying, look, you let Amazon not only come to New York City, but get $3 billion in taxpayer money, declaring themselves to be so anti-union that they would not allow members of their workforce to organize. If we allow them to do that, then everyone else coming after them will say, we're doing the same thing. And I feel like at the end of the day, this is a fight that needed to be fought. And also with respect to their use and support of ICE's work against immigrants in this country, Queens is the most diverse county in the country. We have so many immigrants, both documented and undocumented. How could we as elected officials who represent both a lot of union workers and a lot of immigrants allow Amazon to dictate the terms of this deal, dictate the terms of their arrival? The truth is, Amazon could have fought. They could have actually proposed new ways to do it. And I agree with you, Amazon didn't really fight very hard here. We never saw or heard from Jeff Bezos once. And there was almost no discussion from the time that this deal was announced in early November to today. And I was surprised at the announcement today. Since that time, there's been almost zero work on behalf of Amazon, the governor and the mayor's office, to actually try and solve the problems. Even organized labor said to Amazon that if you agree to be neutral, we might be able to go along with this.
Let's talk about what the people wanted, though, or what it appears they wanted. Amazon says 70% of New Yorkers were in favor. We looked at an independent poll that found 57% of New Yorkers in favor. Now, when you ask them the next question, well, are you in favor of $3 billion in incentives? New Yorkers are more split, 46% support, 44% oppose. But could you also have done anything differently to keep Amazon at the table?
Well, look, again, this is their decision to take their marbles and go home. I met with Amazon, took some criticism from some folks, and I believe that they, at the end of the day, were unwilling to move on anything. I believe it's part of their core values, their corporate values, to crush unions and any ability of their workers to organize, and they didn't want to change. And that's on them. I also think that there was almost no effort to respond to the criticism initially. The rollout was totally mishandled. Doing this in secret, bypassing community review, they were almost destined to fail. But even worse was how they've handled the last 3 months. Their appearances before the city council were dreadfully bad, and they were simply unable and nimble to move and maneuver through what they were going through.
Brad, how much damage has Amazon done to itself here?
No, I think it will recover easily long term, and those jobs will go to Northern Virginia and Nashville and all the other places where Amazon has offices. You know, they're not going to change their anti-union stance. They're not going to change, where they sell their technology. And I think New York and Queens in particular loses out. I mean, look, could Amazon have done this differently? I think they were unprepared for selecting a location that ultimately had this level of opposition, and they didn't have the tools at their disposal to counter the groundswell of action that came from AOC and her allies. They could have done things differently, but I also think New York, unfortunately, is kind of sacrificing the longer-term economic benefits that Amazon would have brought to the city.
Now, Mr. Van Bramer, are you at all concerned about political consequences for you?
Well, look, I understand that there are people who are angry today because of what happened. And look, there are consequences when we take stands. But I'm willing to stand up for what I believe in. I'm willing to fight even the most powerful man in the world because of where I come from and what I believe. And so if there are people who will not support me going forward because I chose to defend working men and women, because I chose to defend immigrants, undocumented and documented, because I chose to defend the city council's meaningful role in land use review, then so be it. I know why I took on this fight, and I'm proud of it.
New York City Councilman Jimmy Van Bramer there, and Bloomberg's Brad Stone. Coming up, the debate over your data, how tech giants like Amazon and Google are expanding their growing information empires as they expand into our homes. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio, listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. As tech giants like Amazon and Google work to place their smart speakers at the center of the internet-connected home, both are expanding the amount of data they gather about customers who use their voice software to control other gadgets. It's stirring up more privacy concerns. We caught up with BetaWorks CEO John Borthwick and Bloomberg Tech's Mac Day on Tuesday.
So Amazon sees an opportunity with its Echo smart speaker and its Ring doorbell company that it purchased last year to really be a kind of force to be reckoned with in home technologies, whether that's shopping with your voice, controlling other gadgets, televisions, thermostats. And this wireless purchase that they made yesterday of a company out of San Francisco is seen as just sort of the next step in that evolution.
John, do you see more pros or cons with Amazon and Google living with us?
I mean, I think that in 2019, the way, when you look at the tech landscape, you can see that, tech with all the promise of doing good and changing society and giving us wonderful tools to enable us to do things is also starting to encroach upon our lives. And I think that the idea of having an open channel for these tech companies into the data stream for my home, and I think Matt will talk about some of the passive data collection that's taking place. I think it is not good. I don't think it's good for consumers. I don't think it's good for our country. I don't think it's good for innovation and for startups.
On one hand, when you put it that way, it is terrifying, Matt, and you wonder if consumers actually understand what is happening. Talk to us about that passive data collection and what these companies are collecting about us that we may not even realize.
So in the last year or two, both Amazon, which is sort of seen as a leader in smart speakers, and Google, right behind them, started talking to their smart device maker partners about increasing the amount of data that they transmit as a matter of course back to that central hub. So what both companies are trying to require now would essentially mandate that any time a smart light bulb, for instance, is toggled, if you go over and flip the switch, that the companies get a record of that, right? And their point is they want to use this to improve the user experience, to make all these new features based upon that knowledge of what's going on in your home.
But what's key is that it's not with the user actually doing anything, right, to the smart speaker.
That's correct, yeah. It's not necessarily, when you invoke Alexa or Google Assistant, it's any time the device status changes.
So how, Matt, first of all, how can consumers protect themselves?
So on this technology, there's not a whole lot of granularity in user control. Both Amazon and Google offer you options to go back in and delete data that the companies have accumulated. They both have websites where you can make that happen. But in terms of sort of stopping the devices from informing the companies in the first place, there's not really a way to do that other than to unplug them from the smart home system.
John, what do you think the social repercussions of this are?
I mean, in the short term, I think that we've seen a few incidences of fairly scary and weird hacks that have taken place where people have hacked into other people's smart homes and started people speaking through like baby monitors or adjusting their thermostats. We've seen sort of software upgrades go haywire and reset people's thermostats and then frozen pipes. And so we've seen sort of small isolated incidences. I think over time, as you start to see the entire home get connected, and in particular, I think the point which Matt's making here, which is key, is that these companies are trying to turn these devices into the central hub that passively collects all the data for the home. And then if that hub either gets hacked or if the company wishes to use it for advertising data or for other data, they're free to do that. And I think you could see the entire home being sort of at the bequest of a single technology provider. And the consumer's not really understanding that that's actually what they're buying in the first place.
Matt, what are the companies saying about this? Because, I presume Amazon would say, well, unless you say Alexa and you turn it on, it's not collecting this data about you.
Oh, on the contrary, they are, even if you don't invoke Alexa. But one of the things, the point Amazon made as I talked with them about this is, listen, we value consumer privacy, which is something a lot of the big technology companies say. And they say they explicitly do not use this for advertising at this time, right? That the data they glean on what you do with your home appliances is not going to be used to inform any sort of advertising. Now, Google, which didn't comment to us for this story, has not made a similar promise, and it's sort of unclear what they're doing with it.
Go ahead, John.
So I think there's two important points there, and we saw this with Facebook, going through the Cambridge Analytica episode and beyond, is that Facebook, this distinction of are they using it for third-party advertising data or are they using it to inform internal data sets is important, and I think that some of the companies are glossing over that. And so I think that they use this and they're using the data for internal data sets, which gives them the ability to more finely grain target customers for a whole bunch of services. That's the first point. The second point relates to data, which I think is critical here, is that we have all these amazing services today that companies are giving us for free, software services. And I think what's important is that quarter after quarter these companies are managing to get more and more margin out of their and profit out of these products. And that's happening because they're monetizing the data behind these services at more and more granular levels. And so I think the fact that we have a handful of companies that are becoming massive data collectors on all sort of quarters of our life is a problem. I don't think it's good for society or good for users or for technology or for startups.
Now, while I have you, John, I want to talk to you about another advertising market, a small but growing one, and that is podcasting. You were an early investor in Gimlet and Anchor, companies that have been bought now by Spotify. People who listen to podcasts love them, but it is still a niche market. What more activity do you expect to see in the podcast market?
So the podcast market it's related to these smart speakers because it's also a voice, it's a voice interface. But I think what we've seen in the last 5 years is this sort of emergence of what I now see as a new wave of innovation and of development that's coming into the podcast market. And so the podcast market really started around 2000. It was a small niche market. But about 5 years ago, we at BetaWorks decided we saw a handful of things which I think were a sort of healthy mix of intuition and data, where we saw on the data side that, people's phones and battery life were getting better and that Bluetooth was more stable and people were connecting to their cars and using their phone as their primary device in their cars. And if you think that Americans on average have about 2 hours a day that they are not connected to a visual interface, and the auditory podcasting interface is this wonderful, deep, rich interface for storytelling, both fictional and non-fictional. And we're seeing, a significant growth there. And the acquisition in the last week of these two companies, two of the biggest acquisitions to date in the space. I think it's the beginning of a whole new wave of media and of interaction in the online space.
Bloomberg Tech's Matt Day and BetaWorks CEO John Borthwick. Coming up, Russia unplugs from the internet. Could an alleged cybersecurity test be a pretext for a crackdown? We'll discuss. This is Bloomberg. Russia is planning to disconnect from the internet. Yes, that means the entire country, temporarily. Legislators are making moves to create a so-called sovereign internet, so traffic goes mostly through domestic portals. Moscow says this is an attempt to test the country's cyber defenses. How well equipped would the country be if it was entirely cut off? However, critics have a different view, saying this risks handing the Kremlin extensive powers to censor the web. Ryan Kalember, Senior Vice President for Cybersecurity Strategy at Proofpoint, joined me Tuesday to discuss.
Well, it means Russia is looking at extremely aggressive options to control pretty much every piece of communication that goes over the internet in their country.
So would this look like China's internet?
That seems to be the implication. They're looking to test their own version of the Great Firewall so that they could not only censor things that they've been censoring for many years now, but also have control over which communication channels were even viable, preventing people from using something like a WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook, etc.
What kind of a firewall does Russia already have in place?
Well, for many, many years now, they've already had lots of different systems in the country's ISPs so that they had a reasonable amount of collection ability. They could see pretty much everything that was going on. They've also, in recent years, developed capabilities to actually block things. And through the legal system, they've also started to ban things like storing Russian people's data in other countries. So just last month, in fact, they reached out to Facebook and Twitter and said, you're not storing Russian citizens' data here in Russia, you're in violation of our laws. So they might use legal excuses to accomplish effectively the same thing.
What are the actual mechanics of this? Presumably this can be done.
Oh, it absolutely can be done, and many countries do it. China is obviously the most obvious example, but in the Middle East, there are many different countries that, for whatever reason, they might be choosing to censor pornography or censor speech they might consider subversive, have set up ways to get the ISPs, which are effectively the only way out of that country from an internet perspective, to block what they choose to block.
Google and Facebook operate in Russia. They don't in China. What would this mean for them?
It would be a challenge. I actually think back to a couple years ago, actually maybe even a couple months ago, Telegram was blocked because it was using a domain, the messaging service, exactly, a domain fronting service hosted on Google to basically operate beyond these censorship restrictions. That was found out, and Google actually adapted to what the Russian government wanted in blocking this domain fronting activity, so an unauthorized service couldn't be conducted in the country. I think actually this will have grave implications for any organization that does not want basically full Russian control of the data flowing across its services.
You raise an interesting point, because we were just talking about Google's exploratory plans in China, and Sundar Pichai has made the point that they actually do have different rules in different countries that they abide by. China is just the one that we all know about. Does Google bend to government demands elsewhere the same way that it might in China if it operated there?
Almost every company rather has to. I mean, we choose not to do business in Russia or China because as a cybersecurity company, it would be virtually impossible for us to conduct our mission of protecting our customers were we to comply with the laws in those countries. But this has a really long history. The fight that AT&T conducted against tapping phones decades and decades ago, there's a lot of resemblance to a lot of these challenges that are going on now. And with governments that are a little bit more heavy-handed, those challenges look a lot different.
Would the Russians still potentially be able to meddle in other countries' elections if they were cut off in this way?
Well, any good cyber attack is not staged from your own servers and your own IP space or anything that can be traced back to you. It's staged from something compromised in some other location entirely. So this wouldn't really hamper their offensive capability.
So how does this fit into the bigger geopolitical issues at play right now?
Well, this is a fairly aggressive move. It's a very interesting thing for them to be able to test because it lets them know that one of the key tools that, say, NATO or the United States might choose to use against them can be blunted or at the very least sort of tolerated by the Russian infrastructure. That's a really interesting piece of knowledge that the West doesn't really have in this conflict.
What would this mean for users inside Russia? And what do we know about how they feel about things like this?
It's a really good question. The long history of sort of subversive speech in Russia being conducted across new apps that pop up, whether they're end-to-end encrypted like a WhatsApp or not, is fairly fascinating, but it's gradually being kind of forced down into things that the Russian state can control. So if Russia really cared about Facebook and Twitter, they wouldn't be pressuring them, and they wouldn't necessarily be shunting everybody to VKontakte, which is the Russian social network, which the Russian government would much prefer everyone use because they can surveil everything that's happening inside it.
So what are the biggest cyber threats you are looking at around the world right now?
Well, for most organizations, the biggest cyber threat will still be the theft of money. We sometimes forget this because this is such a massive geopolitical issue and things like misinformation and election interference dominate the headlines, but that still powers everything from a cybercrime perspective. And of course you have state actors like North Korea. The last time I was on here we were talking about this, pretty much acting like a cyber criminal enterprise. The big scary things though tend to be around either broad Internet of Things or critical infrastructure like power grids, which we do know are being explored in both an adversarial and defense sense by pretty much every government worth its salt with a proper cyber capability. And it's yet to be proven that the Ukraine example, which is probably the closest thing we've seen to a real nightmare from a cybersecurity perspective, is actually viable outside a very small country with one power grid.
That was Proofpoint's Ryan Kalember. Coming up, tech giants from SoftBank to Facebook and Amazon have done business with Saudi Arabia, and now the kingdom wants to rent some space in Silicon Valley, but times may have changed. And Bloomberg Tech is live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out at Technology and follow our global breaking news network, TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. Sprint and T-Mobile executives were in the hot seat in Washington this week as lawmakers grilled them over their proposed $26.5 billion merger. T-Mobile CEO John Legere and Sprint Executive Chairman Marcelo Claure appeared before the U.S. House Communications Subcommittee defending the mega deal against claims that it's a threat to competition.
Our opponents are wrong when they claim that the merger will lead to higher prices. In fact, the opposite is true. Consumers will win with lower prices and better services. How? Our costs will drop sharply and our network capacity will expand tremendously.
9 Democratic senators called for the deal to be stopped in a letter Tuesday, saying it would hurt consumers. Georgetown Law Institute Distinguished Fellow Gigi Sohn and Bloomberg's Todd Shields weighed in on the results of the hearing on Wednesday.
His message was pretty simple, and it's the one we've been hearing for a while, that the merger is good for competition because it will wrap in 5G and such great advancements that'll make the company a stronger competitor to AT&T and Verizon. But it seemed like not everybody was buying it. He fielded a lot of questions from Democrats worried about coverage in rural areas, worried about possible price hikes hiding somewhere within his pledges not to do that.
Gigi, talk to us a little bit more about what lawmakers' biggest concerns are.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's important that the concerns at this hearing today were not just from Democrats, they were bipartisan. And as Todd said, there's concerns that when you combine 4 mobile wireless carriers into 3, prices will go up because you're eliminating a competitor. And particularly, there was concern about low-income consumers, because one of the things that have gotten lost in these merger discussions is the fact that if you combine T-Mobile and Sprint, you're combining 3 of the biggest prepaid carriers. So that's Virgin Mobile, Boost Mobile, and Metro PCS. So this will have a disproportionately harsh impact on low-income consumers. And what's fascinating is that in filings at the Federal Communications Commission, Sprint and T-Mobile's economists have said, yeah, we know that this is going to raise prices on low-income consumers, but they use their cell phones a lot, so they'll just bear the cost, which I think is a remarkable admission.
Now, let's take a listen to some of the pushback. Here's a clip from Congressman Mike Doyle. Listen in.
That would take the prepaid market from where it is right now at $24.67, which is just under DOJ's threshold, to $44.81, a level that raises lots of red flags. These kinds of numbers have historically resulted in higher prices for consumers, less competition, and less innovation.
Now, that said, Todd, didn't John Legere in this hearing promise that prices wouldn't go up?
He said it a couple different ways, but after the hearing, I talked to Doyle, and Doyle's not convinced. And Doyle wants the regulators, the Federal Communications Commission and the Justice Department, to take a quick look. There's lots of, or take a deep look at it. There's a lot of different ways to make pledges about prices and a lot of ways to adjust the prices after and say, oh, gee, look, you've got a lower price considering what you've got. And it's just not trusted right now by some in Washington.
Gigi, is this a promise that if this happens, that Legere would actually be held to?
So this is interesting. So T-Mobile has made a 3-year pricing commitment, promising not to change the prices of rate plans. Now, there are so many loopholes in that you could just drive a truck through it, right? They could change their data caps. They could, increase their network quality and increase charges there. They could increase third-party charges. So that quote-unquote pricing commitment is no commitment at all. But there's a more important point. Particularly in this administration, policymakers have already said, the Assistant Attorney General, Makan Delrahim, has already said, we do not want to be overseeing merger commitments. We do not want to be acting as a regulator and looking at whether companies are abiding by their behavioral commitments. So there's no appetite for behavioral merger conditions, and frankly, they don't work. They didn't work in the Comcast-NBCU merger. In fact, Bloomberg was one of the unfortunate non-beneficiaries of that. They don't work in other mergers, and particularly in this administration, nobody wants to be in the business, neither the FCC nor the Justice Department, of essentially engaging in price regulation.
Now, Legere had quite a few pronouncements at this hearing. Take a listen to this one about Huawei.
let me be clear. There is no Huawei or ZTE equipment in our network today, and there never will be. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever.
Of course, T-Mobile has been involved in a case involving Huawei and allegations that they stole intellectual property from T-Mobile having to do with robotic technology. Todd, what do you make of that pronouncement there from Ledger?
I think it's one that he could easily make. As he even said that we have a history with that company, indicating a bit of distaste with Huawei given their legal entanglements. There was a recent indictment of Huawei by U.S. officials alleging that Huawei stole T-Mobile trade secrets. But one thing you can say is that there's the pledge for T-Mobile itself in the United States. Deal opponents look to the parent corporation, SoftBank in Japan and Deutsche Telekom in Germany, and say, gee, look, there is Huawei gear there. So the influence is arm's length, and maybe that's not far enough, say critics.
Last quick question, Gigi. Can Sprint survive without this deal?
Absolutely. The notion that Sprint is a failing firm is nonsense. They're not even an ailing firm. They just put out their third quarter financials just 2 weeks ago, and they are gaining subscribers in the lucrative postpaid market. Their revenues are increasing across the board in both prepaid and postpaid. They've invested over $1.4 billion in their new networks. And there's nothing about their financials, frankly, for the last several quarters that make anybody think or should make anybody think that Sprint is anywhere near failing. And in fact, they're really on the uprise.
Gigi Sohn with Georgetown Law and Bloomberg's Todd Shields. Well, Saudi Arabia is looking for some office space in San Francisco, specifically for its public investment fund. This follows similar moves from regional neighbors Qatar and Abu Dhabi. The Saudi fund has made several large investments in tech recently, including high-profile bets on Uber and Tesla. This comes just months after Saudi Arabia faced international condemnation for the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi at its Istanbul consulate. Nuala O'Connor, the CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology, discussed this issue with us on Wednesday.
It's obviously a hot market, and there's lots of foreign investment in Silicon Valley and across the United States tech sector. The concern really is one of values and whose values are driving the creation of new products, services, and apps. We've seen just recently some outcry over the creation or the support of an app led by the Saudi government that allows people to track female associates or relatives. These are concerning kinds of applications, and we would obviously want to espouse democratic values and values of equality and liberty. That's part of my organization's name, is Democracy and Technology. So the question for me is one of what kind of values are we embedding in the technology in our daily lives?
Do you think these companies, which have certainly done business with the Saudis in the past, will change their tune?
Well, this has been an age-old debate since there's been a tech sector in the United States as they've expanded and done business in other countries. And it is also a conflict, a little bit of laws and of cultures. The international internet allows for the export of U.S.-centric values by U.S. companies and vice versa from other countries and other values and other companies. So we're at the conversational point about Saudi Arabia that we've been at about China and other countries and how they run their internal operations and how they use technology.
So where do you think this goes? There has been a lot of private talk whispering about whether companies should or shouldn't take SoftBank's money because so much of SoftBank's Vision Fund money comes from the Saudi government. Do you think this issue dies, or does it continue to be an issue? Because I certainly have yet to hear someone say, we didn't take that $500 million because it came from SoftBank.
I think it's very difficult when there's that kind of money on the table to make those kind of choices, I'm sure, for the corporate leadership. But I do think the conversation is absolutely going to continue about the values and the norms and the democratic principles embedded in the products and services that companies are creating, and the sources not only of funds, but of revenue from the sales of those products. And I see those calls coming as much from within Silicon Valley and the employees of many of these companies as I do from outside, from civil society and groups like mine. So I think this is a conversation that we're just beginning in many parts of this country and really around the world. This is not the last we'll see of it.
Meantime, I want to talk to you about trust of the tech industry more broadly. There's a recent poll out conducted by YouGov, which shows that Facebook is one of the country's least trusted institution, right down at the bottom by Congress, whereas Google and Amazon are towards the top. And yet Facebook just reported earnings, and it keeps growing. It doesn't seem to be losing users. People are still using it. How do you square that?
Well, it's a terrific platform in many ways, and it's useful and it's free. I do think that we are having a conversation about the use of information and the use of personal information by companies of all kinds, not just in the tech sector. So I think that may account for some of the difference in the various brands' trust factors. But I think we are in a position now as a country to have a conversation about the use of personal information by all companies and the respect and the dignity that companies allow their customers, their employees, their partners. I think we're going to see comprehensive privacy law in the United States in the near term to put us back on the global playing field about privacy and data.
How much do you think consumers actually want comprehensive privacy regulation?
I think that the pendulum has swung very far in the direction that more and more average users, citizens of this country, realize that they're not necessarily getting a fair deal as people in other parts of the world are getting, even from some of our own companies, in the protection and use of data and the disclosure of how those data are being used by the company. I think that there is a very practical reality. People want to use these services and they want to be part of the internet economy, but they want to know a little bit more and have a little bit more balance of power between the individual and the companies themselves.
Nuala O'Connor of the Center for Democracy and Technology. Coming up, competition in smart speakers heating up. We will hear from the CEO of Sonos about how they plan to stay ahead of their big-name rivals. This is Bloomberg. Sonos shares were sent tumbling after the company reported higher inventory levels, even as results topped estimates in its last earnings report. Analysts said the inventory issue was disappointing, although most remain broadly positive on the speaker company's future. This comes as the smart speaker space continues to be filled with hot competition from Apple, Amazon, and Google. So how does Sonos plan to keep up with the rest? We discussed with Sonos CEO Patrick Spence on Monday.
It's always hard to know what's driving the sentiment in the market and with investors. I think, we're still a young public company, and so I think investors are still looking to see how we perform over a long period of time. Hardware companies haven't always fared so well, so I think we're a bit paying for sins of the past as we think about other hardware companies that haven't persevered over the long term.
The speaker market has exploded with competition. Amazon, Apple, Google, some more successful than others. Who do you think of as your main competitor?
Well, when you look at it right now, we think about kind of the silent home as our main competition. When we look at the players that are out there, a lot are actually helping more people get into the habit of listening out loud. And there's always been cheap speakers, Bluetooth speakers, those kind of things. And that's really where Google and Amazon and players like that have played in time. And we're the option for those that kind of get a taste of either a voice assistant or a music streaming service and want to listen on something a little better, built to last longer in your home.
So is any one of these companies taking more share than others? I mean, I know you can listen to Alexa on your Sonos speaker, so there are partnerships at play as well.
Yeah, so we work with all of the companies that are in the voice space, also the music streaming space, right? So we work with Spotify, Pandora, SiriusXM, Amazon, Apple, you name it. And so one of the benefits is that we build products that are really built to last for a long period of time. They sound great, and they work with all the services. So you're not trapped in one ecosystem. You can always get whatever you want. And I think that's what consumers are really choosing and why we're able to hit record sales as well last quarter.
Okay, but Amazon and Google have sold a lot of speakers.
Certainly,
and that's not somebody choosing any ecosystem. That's someone choosing a specific ecosystem.
That's right. But then when you're in that ecosystem, the nice thing is that if you're using one of those products and then you think, hey, this is kind of nice. I want to get something for another room of the home, or maybe I want something that kind of looks a little better, sounds better, and maybe also works with Apple or also works with Google. If you bought an Amazon one, that's where Sonos comes in.
So JP Morgan thinks Apple should buy Sonos. What do you think of that?
Right now, I'm really focused on making sure we're a successful independent company. We've been working hard to make sure that we're doing the right thing for the consumers, and ultimately, I don't control that.
Would you be open to a deal if an offer made itself? available?
You know, myself and the other board members would obviously have to look at that and consider, you know, any offer from any company. But right now, I'm really focused on making sure we're a successful public company for the long term.
Now, you're re-examining the Chinese supply chain as a result of the trade war. Tell us what you're seeing and what is Plan B?
Well, so, you know, we've been in China for a long time. The whole supply chain's been built there. Every component is there as well. And I think last week there was some noise that was incorrect about what we were doing. But certainly, we've had a global expansion plan for a while, and you always want to be in the places where your customers are, those kind of things. And so we've always thought about taking our supply chain outside of China, in addition to China, never, you know, leaving China, but rather augmenting it. And so we've accelerated those plans on the back of all the tariff noise and everything like that. But that's not something new. That's something we've been working on for months.
So where are you taking the supply chain?
We're considering a couple other spots, but ultimately, since we have a lot of customers in North America, we have a lot of customers in Europe, we'll want to be geographically close to those locations.
Have you seen any impact on sales as a result of the trade war?
We have not, and thankfully to this point, we have not been impacted by the tariffs, so we've been in a good position.
And what would the timeline be for moving your supply chain to different places?
Well, I think again, it's augmenting, but that's something that we want to be able to do, you know, late this year, early next.
And how about a timeline for getting the inventory issues under control?
We've already moderated those. We've had a great January. So we just said last week, you know, it was a couple weeks of inventory. So I think that got a bit overblown, quite frankly.
So talk to us about new product launches and what we'll see beyond speakers.
Yeah, so there's really kind of three ways I think about this. One is that we're really focused on new homes in new countries, because today only 5 countries represent 80% of our sales. So kind of job one is going to new countries. Job two is new products, right? Because we've been at sound for a long period of time, but very focused on the home, right? And so now we're looking outside the home. There's a lot of other places of audio as you think about auto, you think about headphones, you think about commercial. There's a whole bunch of other areas that I think our system gives us unique possibilities into. And the third thing I'd say is that we're also looking at what services we could be offering our customers as well, because that's an interesting area for us. What would be a great thing for listeners for Sonos to offer? And so those are kind of the way I think of the 3 areas.
Would you ever become a content provider like a Spotify or an Apple?
You know, I don't know. There seems to be a lot of a focus there right now, and I think a lot of companies that are doing that very well. So I think we're looking for things that could put us, you know, and do things for listeners that are a little different than what other companies are doing today.
That was Sonos CEO Patrick Spence. Well, the start to 2019 has been sobering for the journalism industry. Major publishers like BuzzFeed, Vice, Gannett, and more laid off thousands of employees. Sadly, this is becoming something of the norm for journalism since the advent of the internet. According to a 2018 Pew study, at least 36% of newspapers have experienced layoffs between January 2017 and April of last year. That number is 23% for digitally native outlets. Tim Cadigan, CEO of OpenX, one of the world's largest digital ad exchanges, weighed in on the current state of digital media and advertising on Wednesday.
Well, I think, you know, the underlying question is the business model, right? And the business model is one of advertising. And advertising is kind of tale of two cities today. So overall advertising is doing extremely well. Advertising 2018 grew about 7%, twice the rate of the economy. Digital advertising grew 15%. Facebook grew 30%. So what's interesting about that is there is a lot of money being made in advertising, but there's an asymmetry here, which is a lot of people's time is spent on sites and apps outside of the major walled gardens like Google and Facebook. But the ad dollars are not matching that today.
Why?
So what's going on is that when you advertise on Facebook, let's take them for example, you reach a huge audience, you reach it with a lot of data, so it's scaled, it's efficient, it's effective, and it's actually pretty easy. So it works very well. So ad dollars are shifting over there. But marketers want to be able to spend in more than 2 places. And so the rest of the open web, which is many of the businesses you're talking about, they're part of what I would call the open web. They need an advertising model that works more like what works on Facebook and Google.
So what's it going to take to redistribute? Because I certainly don't spend half my time on, or all my time on Google and Facebook.
Correct, exactly. So there you go. So that's the problem. And so I would call it people-based marketing. And so what we need is a system that operates like people-based marketing on a walled garden for the open web, so that the ad dollars can follow the users and the attention that is being generated by all of those great outlets that are doing great journalism.
How do we do that?
So, you know, you lean a little bit on companies like mine and peers in the space to frankly innovate more, and that's a little bit, you know, the background of our Google Cloud deal, to innovate more and to get closer and provide a more viable complement to those really big systems.
Isn't that bad for Google, your new partner?
So Google is a multifaceted player, right? So for us alone, they are a big partner, they are a big customer, they're one of the biggest buyers.
And they're a competitor.
They're a competitor, and now they're a technology vendor. And so we embrace all those aspects, and that's sort of the way the world works.
Do you think that Google and Facebook's business models are under threat by relying so much on consumer data?
No, I don't. I think that they have a very strong position because they create incredible consumer products, and they have a great trade-off between consumers and advertising for those products.
What about Amazon?
Amazon,
which
I think,
is growing in the ad business.
Increasingly, I've used the word triopoly because it's really the three players, not just the two players. And Amazon is building a very large advertising business very quickly. It has a number of great assets. It has amazing consumer data. It understands, of course, what people buy. And it has millions of merchants who want to reach those consumers.
OpenX CEO Tim Cadogan there. Coming up, Canada's answer to Tesla might not be what you would expect. We take an all-electric three-wheeler for a ride on the streets of Vancouver. This is Bloomberg. Finally, you've probably never seen a vehicle like the one we're going to show you next. But if a publicly traded Canadian company has its way, it won't be long before you see a lot of them. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow reports from Vancouver.
All electric like a Tesla, priced like a Ford Fiesta, and one of the weirdest looking vehicles you've ever seen. Introducing the Solo.
A clean energy electric vehicle for one person was an opportunity that was too great not to seize.
The three-wheel EV costs $15,500 and is being hand-built in Vancouver by Electromechanica. The company has 23,000 Solo pre-orders. To meet demand, it's going to mass-produce an updated model in China.
The vehicle concept was always to have a vehicle that could be assembled quickly, efficiently, and with high quality in under 3 hours, and that it can.
The Solo has 100 miles of range and charges in 3 hours. It's designed with a specific group in mind. The company says 83% of North American commuters drive to work alone each day. But the question is whether those commuters would be prepared to drive to work in something like this that you can just fit in. The company's optimism isn't backed up by the numbers.
7 out of 10 of what the consumer is buying is a truck at this point. So the idea of a single-seater, I think, limits you to a very specific user.
But there are areas Bloomberg Intelligence sees as more promising. Electromechanica is looking at car sharing, and 7-Eleven and DHL are already testing for deliveries.
You don't need to have 2 seats in a delivery vehicle. You've got 1 employee. Why is the second seat there?
Investors still need convincing. Shares have fallen since the company IPO'd on the Nasdaq last August. But CEO Kroll says the Solo will be profitable.
25% gross profit is built into the design of the car, and that's absolutely fine.
The company hopes to deliver 5,000 China-produced Solos in 2019, then a further 20,000 in 2020. Longer term, production could be brought back home. General Motors announced in October it was closing its Oshawa site after more than 100 years of manufacturing in Canada. CEO Kroll says the company is interested in the site. They're also eyeing more passengers with a sporty 2-seater all-electric Roadster. But can it handle the challenge of meeting billions of dollars worth of pre-orders? Ed Ludlow, Bloomberg News, Vancouver.
That does it for this edition of the Best of Bloomberg Technology. We will bring you all the latest in tech throughout the week. You can tune in every day, 5 p.m. in New York, 2 p.m. in San Francisco. Bloomberg Tech, live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology, and follow our global breaking news network, TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg.